On this edition of Independent Sources, discretionary spending. 4 city council members employ new strategies to quell increasing distrust of government spending.
Same-sex abuse. The gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender community battle stereotypes and underreporting in their fight against domestic violence.
And Indigenous Me. How more communities are finding innovative ways of promoting their indigenous identity. Welcome to Independent Sources. I'm Viano Ravinka.
And I'm Gary Pierre-Pierre. 4 city council members are trying to curry favor with their constituents by finding new uses for the much maligned pot of money known as pork.
Under the new practice called Participatory Budgeting, the council members will allow their constituents to decide how to best use $1 million or so of their discretionary funds. The money will also be used to back local capital projects like street repairs and new parks. The 4 council members include Brad Lander and Jumani Williams of Brooklyn, Eric Ulrich of Queens, and Melissa Mark Viverito of Manhattan.
I spoke with Melissa Mark Viverito about why she and her fellow council members are only now implementing this practice that has been used for years in other parts of the world, such as Brazil and Africa. Councilwoman, we've heard of participatory democracy, even participatory journalism, now participatory budgeting. Can you tell us exactly what that is and why are we even going there?
Well, participatory budgeting has been implemented in many countries outside of the United States, Latin America, European nations. So what we had been approached, some of us in the City Council had been approached by some local organizations to talk about the idea of implementing participatory budgeting here in New York City. There's only one other city and one council member in Chicago, Joe Moore, he's an alderman, it's basically a city council member, that implemented this about 3 years ago. And so he came to New York about 2 years ago, talked about his experience with implementing participatory budgeting. I was in the forum, as were some of my other colleagues, and we decided that there were a group of us that wanted to explore this idea. Bottom line is that the taxpayers should have an ability to kind of weigh in a little bit about how that money is spent. So monies that we have available as council members, discretionary monies, to invest and reinvest in our communities, the 4 of us that are doing this really felt that we wanted to engage our constituents in a dialogue about how that money should be spent.
Well, how does that work logistically? How do you get people to approve project and proposal, or to even suggest? How do you plan on doing that? Put that mechanism into place?
Well, first of all, it's a logistically intensive process, right? Each of us as council members represents a district about 170,000 individuals. My district is geographically challenging in that I represent East Harlem, part of the Upper West Side, Manhattan Valley, and part of the South Bronx. So what we've done is in several rounds. The first round was having these neighborhood assemblies where we would call people, convene meetings with our constituents and say, we're putting $1 million on the table of capital money. We want to know what things and improvements would you like to see in your community, and how do you think we should spend that $1 million? So a whole bunch of ideas were generated out of that. I did 7 neighborhood assemblies in my district, and a lot of ideas came out of it.
Such as?
Basically things that we had heard of and some interesting things. One was about a greenhouse, possibly, on public housing property. Some of it was repaving roads, improving playgrounds, bringing more security cameras into our public housing developments. Some things that are really also creative and innovative, like the greenhouse idea. So it was a way of generating ideas. The second phase was to get volunteers, constituents, to then sit within meetings within task forces like public housing or transportation or health to talk about, okay, let's try to bring these ideas down to a couple of ideas. And in those conversations we facilitated conversations with different city agencies to have a conversation about, okay, what ideas can be funded, what ideas is the city not going to fund, because we need to get an idea of what would be invested or what the city would allow and what was not be allowed. And now we're having a second round of meetings where we're now bringing back those ideas. So every committee has about 4 or 5 ideas within it that will then possibly be on the ballot, and there's going to be a vote at the end of March.
How much is it empowering regular people as opposed to sort of like your gadfly? People are really active. They go to every council meetings, every community board meetings. I mean, how do you ensuring that just the average person is participating in this process?
Well, what we've seen is we've seen across the 7 neighborhood assemblies, we had about 700 people show up.
Okay.
And these are people from all walks of life throughout all aspects of the district. We had a great turnout. And the level of community ownership that people have taken to this process has really been inspiring. People have committed to it, are giving time, they're volunteering their time, they understand the importance of this, they're letting their neighbors know about it, they're going to help be advocates in getting the vote out in March. So people are really taking ownership because at the end of the day, it's their money, and they should have a say in how it's spent. So they've been giving us a lot of ideas, and it's not going to only be useful for those projects that people vote on. I'm going to use the feedback from my constituents as a way of informing me in other monies that will be allocated throughout our districts, informing the work that we do out of our office. So it's really being inclusive, letting people know that you are a stakeholder, you live, work in your community, you should definitely take greater ownership for the decisions that are being made. And I, as a council member, I am including you in those conversations, and I take what you have to say very seriously.
No, it's interesting because only 4 of you on the city council have decided to experiment with this idea. Why only 4 out of 51? How many?
Well, 51 members of the city council. Granted, this is only the 2nd city in the nation that is doing this. So it's a relatively new concept, although other countries and all the regions
Well, it started
have been
in Brazil about 20 years ago.
Right, Porto Alegre, it's happening in many countries. But it's the first time. So obviously, in Chicago, we still have 1 alderman that is doing it, and he's in his 3rd year. So what we're hoping to do is to share our experiences with our colleagues and encourage others to consider adding themselves to this next year. But as I mentioned, there is a lot of work that goes into it. And so our hope is that we can partner up with private monies and private foundations as a way of supporting this process, because it is truly empowering, and it really is about giving democracy back to our constituents.
Well, so where do you see this moving? How wide can this move within the city council?
Well, I'm hoping that, again, my hope is that we could double the number of council members that are doing it.
And what's the time frame for that?
Well, we go through the budget cycle, but right now we're completing the process for the first year.
That's 2013.
Right, for the fiscal year 2012, 2013, and we're hoping to include others for the next round of the budget. But obviously, it's also, we're laying the groundwork, we're laying the foundation for this because it's complicated. We also have capital monies available to us. We also have expense monies available to us. So are we going to do this with our expense monies? Can we expand the number of projects beyond the $1 million? There's a lot that goes into it, and it's a fluid process because nothing is fixed. We never know at the end of the day how much money is available to us as a council. That's always negotiated with the mayor. It changes year to year. So it's a little bit balancing act, but we are, this is going to be a reality. There's going to be $1 million minimum invested from those 4 districts, and it's going to fund projects in our communities. So I think that the level of interest that it has had, not only in the press, but within our circles in our communities, has really been exciting.
Well, basically, what have you learned so far in this experiment that you've changed, that led you to change courses a little bit and try a different route?
Well, I think what it shows is, the community that I represent has been historically a disenfranchised community. It's low income, people of color predominantly. I have the largest concentration of public housing, and people feel, it's not that they're apathetic. I don't believe that that's the case. I believe that because government is not asking for people to participate and to genuinely take their interests and their concerns to heart and seek that input, that's why people become disillusioned. That's why people sometimes don't want to be engaged. So what we're showing is that, no, this is your money, you have something to say about it, and we're genuinely going to support what you have to say, and people are responding very positively. And that, I think, is the greatest message, is that you want greater civic engagement. That's what this process is demonstrating, that when you involve people and when you genuinely respect their ideas, they're going to respond and they're going to be involved. And that, to me, as an elected, is ultimately what I want. I want my community engaged, informed, and active, and that's what this process gives to people.
Well, thank you very much. Good luck.
Thank you.
Councilwoman Melissa Viverito, thanks for joining us.
And thank you for inviting me.
Stay tuned. When we come back, we learn how domestic abuse is more prevalent in the LGBT community than most believe.
Before that, Zyphus LeBrun has some other news.
Thanks, Gary. Here's a look at some headlines from the ethnic media. El Diario La Prensa reports that bodegas have become alternative pharmacies in some Latino neighborhoods, selling medicine not approved by the FDA. The paper visited a few bodegas in East Harlem and confirmed how easy and inexpensive it is to buy medications in some of these establishments. In fact, the newspaper highlights how some stores are playing the role of doctors and nurses, prescribing and even injecting medications such as contraceptives. The website Islamophobia Today is taking on Mayor Michael Bloomberg, criticizing his justifications for secretly monitoring the American Muslim community. The opinion piece calls his stance on the practice unethical, disgusting, and morally repugnant. It also says that the term war on terror is, quote, cowardly fear-mongering and an attempt to strip citizens of their basic civil rights. Those fighting housing discrimination based on race, sexuality, or disability in New York will have monetary assistance thanks to Washington, the Amsterdam News reports. The New York State Division of Human Rights, in a partnership with the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development, was awarded close to $500,000 to ensure the protection of rights of New York residents. The federal funds will be used to finance legal staff needed to prosecute housing discrimination cases in state courts. Bangla Patrika reports that the Bronx Bangladeshi community is already working on getting candidates to run for a city council seat representing District 18 in September 2013. The publication reports that there are already 3 candidates competing to best represent the community's interests at City Hall. District 18 in the Bronx comprises Parkchester, Castle Hill, and Soundview. And finally, from the Jewish Forward, a group of women who were seeking to join the all-male Orthodox Ambulance Corps have decided instead to establish a separate all-women's service. The group, who are now calling themselves Ezras Nashim, which means the women's section of the synagogue in Hebrew, will focus on assisting women in services such as emergency births. The group of female EMTs spent nearly a year trying to volunteer with the Hatzalah Ambulance Corps with no success. Their services rely only on donations. Those were just a few headlines from the ethnic media. Back to Gary and Vianora in the studio.
Over 1 million women and over 800,000 men are victims of domestic abuse every year. That's according to statistics from the American Bar Association.
Those facts are even more sobering when you figure in the reality that those numbers include both straight and gay couples. And just like in the case of heterosexual couples, the incidents are underreported.
But unlike straight couples, LGBT couples have to deal with a stigma associated with being gay or lesbian. I spoke with Brides March organizer Grace Perez and Brett Figlevsky, staff attorney at Sanctuary for Families LGBT initiative, about how the issue of same-sex couple violence is out in the open. Grace, how serious is domestic violence in same-sex relationships?
Very serious as it is in heterosexual relationships.
And Brett, what's the prevalence? Is it about the same as in opposite-gendered relationship?
Yes, all studies seem to indicate that domestic violence, at least the prevalence of domestic violence, is the same across the spectrum for opposite-sex relationships and same-sex relationships.
And how, what obstacles do victims of abuse in same-sex relationships encounter different than those encountered by people in heterosexual relationships? Brett?
Right. Well, I think there are some additional obstacles, probably primarily having to do with the degree of awareness that exists regarding battered women. I'm not sure. In fact, that does not seem to be the same for LGBT communities. So I think a lot of individuals don't believe that there can be domestic violence in an intimate relationship between 2 men or 2 women, for instance. I think for a long time there was a philosophical barrier that women could not be batterers or men could not be victims. But we know that that's not true. So I think that is probably one of the largest barriers, is just awareness, both in the larger community and within LGBT communities, that intimate partner violence does exist.
There's another barrier, and that is that There aren't as many programs, services, resources for same-sex violence victims as there are for women who are not.
And what about the responses from traditional services, Grace? What if victims turn to traditional services? What kind of responses are they likely to get?
Well, today is very different than it was a couple of years back. There's a lot more awareness and a lot more training to service providers on these issues. So they don't get turned away. I hope that they're not, but still the services have to be tailored, and those that are providing the services have to be trained to particularly address a certain issue. And that's not just in the gay and lesbian community, but also in communities of color, communities of cultural differences. So there's still that need for greater training and sensibility and awareness and specific tailored services. But no one gets turned away. If you are a victim of domestic violence, you should not be turned away.
Brett, how supportive has the LGBT community been to victims? You've already hinted that perhaps it has not been as supportive. And what about the lesbian community and that idea that men are more violent than women? Can you talk about that?
Well, I think that probably within LGBT communities there is growing awareness and support for victims of domestic violence. I think probably it's important to mention that up until only a few years ago, one could only go to family court for an order of protection if one was married or had a child in common with the abuser. So that de facto left out most victims of violence in an LGBT relationship. So there were a lot of structural barriers in addition to the philosophical barriers that I mentioned before. I think now with that change in the law, that change happened in 2008, there's been a lot of increased awareness, a lot of efforts on the part of various social service organizations, mine, others, AVP comes to mind, the Urban Justice Center, New York Legal Assistance Group. There are many organizations now which are addressing specifically the issue of domestic violence within LGBT communities. So I think awareness is growing and there's a lot of support, and I think it's also understood as part of the larger struggle against violence against LGBT individuals generally, so hate crimes and things of that nature.
Grace, recently Bride's March took place and you are one of the organizers. How has this issue of domestic violence within same-sex relationships surfaced within the march, and what have been the responses?
The Bride's March, or the Gladys Ricard and Victims of Domestic Violence Memorial Walk, remembers all victims of domestic violence. And we know that all communities, regardless of race, sexual orientation, regardless of economic, social, educational background, there are victims. So we are covering and we are remembering all the victims of domestic violence along with Gladys Ricard.
Why do you think that so far there's not been that much awareness about domestic violence within same-sex relationships, Grace?
Well, first of all, the issue of domestic violence alone is one that many still believe that it's something between partners or husband and wife, as the term was before. And people don't talk about that. People don't want to become involved in something like that for various reasons, their own personal biases or their own personal experiences that they wish to just move on and forget about. So that's the first thing. And second is that it's very difficult. It's a very difficult issue, and it's something that we have to, it can't no longer be condoned. Too many people, children, women, total strangers to the violence, are losing their lives. In New York alone, Well, first of all, in the country, 1.3 million victims are physically assaulted by an intimate partner every year in the United States. And here in New York City, from the past 10 years that we have been organizing this march, we have over 600 people who have lost their lives specifically due to domestic violence.
Brett, what is your organization currently working on to address the needs of the victims?
Well, I helped start our LGBT initiative at Sanctuary for Families. I joined Sanctuary in 2004, and a couple of years later, 2006, we launched our initiative. And at that time, a lot of our efforts really revolved around the effort to change the law regarding access to family court. And with the help of a lot of other organizations, we launched our Fair Access to Family Court effort, and as I said before, we're successful. And that has made just a huge difference and has really enabled all victims of domestic violence to seek a civil order of protection. That's really what it means. Since then, we've been expanding our outreach to LGBT social service organizations. We conduct trainings regarding domestic violence. Increasingly, we're looking at the extent to which LGBTQ youth, especially homeless LGBTQ youth, are victims of violence, often human trafficking or other forms of commercial sexual exploitation. We regard that also as a form of gender-based violence and something that's really been unrecognized and needs to be addressed. So we're doing increased outreach to that group of young people as well.
Brett Figlewski, Grace Perez, thank you very much for being with us today.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Still to come on Independent Sources, we'll tell you how some indigenous people in New York City are trying to reinvigorate their communities.
My name is Fernanda. I'm the wife of a teacher. Budget cuts affected my husband's salary, so I'm picking up some part-time work. We're doing everything we can to make sure our kids eat today. Tomorrow, I just don't know. Fernanda, how'd I do?
Well, I usually fold the underwear first.
I meant the acting, but good to know.
Play a role in ending hunger. Visit feedingamerica.org/hunger and find your local food bank.
The smallest moments can have the biggest impact on a child's life. Take time to be a dad today.
Finally from us tonight, more people than ever seem to be claiming their indigenous African or Latin American roots.
Here in New York, a few organizations are trying to promote indigenous identity through theater and festivals. Marlene Peralta tells us more.
Como yo he dicho, primero soy quichua, luego soy ecuatoriano. Mi identidad es con el pueblo indígena, mi identidad son mucho más de los 200 años que tiene de vida republicana el Ecuador.
My father's from Mexico and my mother's from Colombia, so the Colombian side I recognize as Chibcha.
Fabian Buenala and Javier Enriquez are very proud of their indigenous cultural identity, an identity that has a history of being tarnished, oppressed, and discriminated against.
The kind of marginalization that has taken place in countries like Peru or Bolivia is striking, and unfortunately, I don't think that they have been considered full citizens.
This discrimination dates back to when the Spanish Creoles, who led the independence movement in South America, identified more with their European ancestry rather than the prominent indigenous people. These days, that's changing.
We grew up, my sister and I, being Mexicanas, Mexican, because my mom would always say, no se les olvide, you're Mexican, son Mexicanas, son Mexicanas. And she never said, you're Indian, you're indigenous. Never.
Hortensia Colorado and her sister Elvira are descendants of the Chichimecas, a diverse indigenous group from the north of Mexico.
For me, the discovery of who I am and where I came from came through our theater work and going back to search for our identity of who we are and where we came from. And it comes from our stories.
Sister Moon, you race across the night sky, being pursued by your brother.
Here in New York, the Colorado sisters are using theater, and Enriquez has created the organization Associated Indigenous Movement as a platform to educate others about their culture and create a renewed sense of pride in indigenous people. Buenala has also helped start an organization called Quechua Nation.
¿Por qué Quichua? Porque somos parte de un pueblo, no solamente quichuas del Ecuador, sino también con miras a que los quichuas que estamos en andinos, que básicamente empieza en el sur de Colombia, Ecuador, Perú, Bolivia, norte de Chile y norte de Argentina, tengamos la oportunidad de una identidad.
According to Professor Mathews-Salazar, this revival of indigenous identity started in 1992 during the 500th anniversary of the Spanish arrival in the Americas. During that time, several organizations emerged to validate the indigenous identity throughout Latin America.
This expansion of Indian movements is what has funneled what we see in New York today. To that we need to add globalization, the way it is experienced in the 21st century, the expansion of the internet and other social media has contributed immensely to this diffusion.
The expansion of indigenous pride was reflected in the latest census figures. The data showed that more Hispanics are now identifying as Native Americans. Now the next big step moving forward is to create a sense of unity among all indigenous communities. Marlene Peralta for Independent Sources.
That's our show this week. Thanks for tuning in.
Until the next time, be independent-minded.